The sky over Bremen on October 8, 1943, was a cathedral of violence. It was the opening act of a coordinated bombing campaign that would become known as Black Week for the United States Army Air Forces. Over 350 heavy bombers, B-17 flying fortresses, plowed through a relentless defense of flak and fighters. The air was scribbled with contrails, smudged with black smoke, and filled with the thunder of engines and the percussive crack of artillery shells. In this chaotic heaven, the B-17F, named All-American of the 97th Bomb Group, flew in tight formation with the 414th Bomb Squadron. At its controls was 21-year-old Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg, Jr., a quiet, capable pilot from Alabama. The mission was a maximum effort against the Focke-Wulf aircraft plant. For the young American crew, it was their fifth mission, a milestone that felt less like an achievement and more like a statistical reprieve. The fortress lived up to its name, a seemingly impregnable fortress of .50 caliber machine guns protruding from its nose, chin, top, ball, waist, and tail. But the German defenses were prepared. As the formation approached the initial point for its bomb run, the world dissolved into a nightmare of orchestrated destruction. Flak burst among the boxes of bombers with sickening accuracy, shaking aircraft like toys. Then, the fighters came. Among the interceptors was a pilot of Jagdgeschwader 11, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler. At 28, Stigler was a veteran of the North African campaign, an ace with over 24 victories. He was a skilled and disciplined pilot, but he was also a man who still held to a fatting code of chivalry instilled in him by his late commander, Gustav Rödel, who had famously told his men, "You fight by rules to keep your humanity. If I ever hear of you shooting a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." On this day, flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109G, Stigler had already damaged 2 B-17s, sending them faltering out of formation. He was low on fuel and ammunition, scanning for a final, clean kill to add to his tally before returning to base. That's when he saw the All-American. The bomber was alone, lagging badly from its group. It was a straggler, the most vulnerable creature in the aerial ecosystem. As Stigler closed in from the rear, his practiced eye cataloged the damage. Smoke streamed from the No. 2 engine. Hydraulic fluid painted the fuselage. The entire left stabilizer and elevator were shredded. But it was the tail section that made him freeze, his thumb poised over the cannon trigger. The entire rear of the B-17 was a mangled skeleton. The left horizontal stabilizer was mostly gone. The elevator was a ragged piece of metal. The rudder was shot to pieces. And the tail gunner's position, the entire plexiglass enclosure, had been sheared off cleanly, leaving a gaping hole into the fuselage. It was a miracle the aircraft was still flying. Stigler expected it to spin out of control at any second. He nudged his throttle and slid his Messerschmitt closer, so near he could see the faces of the American crew. He flew formation with the crippled bomber, staring in disbelief. He saw the tail gunner, 19-year-old Sergeant Sam Blackie Blackford, slumped in his harness, bloody but alive, exposed to the 250-mile-per-hour slipstream at degrees Fahrenheit. He saw the terrified waist gunners staring back at him through their windows. This was not an enemy aircraft. This was a wreck full of wounded boys trying to go home. To shoot it down, he thought, would be no different than shooting men in parachutes. It would be murder, not combat. Inside the All-American, panic had crystallized into a desperate, focused will to survive. The collision, which they would later learn was with a German Focke-Wulf FW-190 that had itself been destroyed in the impact, had been cataclysmic. The bomber had shuddered as if hit by a train. Bragg and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Harry Nusel, fought the controls as the aircraft tried to pitch into a fatal dive. The control cables for the elevators and rudder which ran through the demolished tail were damaged but, miraculously, not severed. They had partial control, but it was like trying to steer a massive ship with a broken tiller. The trim tabs were useless. Keeping the aircraft level required constant, brutal physical pressure on the yokes. The interphone crackled with damage reports. The tail was gone. Blackford was wounded but conscious. One engine was dead, another streaming oil. The ball turret was inoperative, its gunner trapped until they could crank him up manually. The radio was out. They were alone over hostile territory, hundreds of miles from safety. Bragg made the only decision there was. They would try to make it to England. He ordered the crew to jettison everything that wasn't bolted down, ammunition, damaged equipment, even their flak vests, to lighten the stricken aircraft. They had no idea the German ace shadowing them was deciding their fate. For 10 long minutes, Franz Stigler flew off the B-17's wing. He made no hostile moves, he simply watched. He saw the gunners training their weapons on him but holding fire. He understood their discipline. Firing might provoke him or cause him to roll and attack from a different angle. It was a silent, surreal standoff. Stigler's mind raced. He thought of his brother, a bomber pilot killed earlier in the war. He weighed his duty against his conscience. Finally, he made his choice. He knew the B-17's most immediate threat was not him, but the heavy flak batteries along the North Sea coast. If they saw this crippled bomber, they would finish it without a second thought. Stigler edged his Bf-109 even closer. He caught Bragg's eye in the cockpit, pointed forward, and then gestured vehemently toward the coastline ahead. He was trying to tell them to turn to avoid the heaviest concentrations of anti-aircraft guns. The Americans didn't understand. He then rocked his wings and, with one last long look at the impossible flying wreck, peeled away, heading back toward Germany. He would return to base and report no kills, saying nothing of the encounter. The ordeal for the All-American was far from over. For over 2 hours, Bragg and Nüssel wrestled the controls. The aircraft was terrifically unstable. Any change in power or pressure would send it into a dangerous yaw or pitch. The wounded tail gunner, Blackford, was pulled inside the fuselage by his crewmates, who risked the howling wind to haul him to relative safety. The navigator, Lieutenant Robert McCallum, used dead reckoning and prayer to chart a course. They crossed the North Sea, the gray water a terrifying promise of a frozen grave if they lost their fight with gravity. When the white cliffs of England finally appeared through the haze, a new problem arose: landing. The shot-up hydraulic system meant no brakes. The damaged tail meant they could not flare properly. The bomber was a runaway train with wings. Bragg chose the longest runway he could find, at an American base in East Anglia. He called for emergency services and cut the engines on final approach. The All-American hit the runway hard and fast, metal screeching. It skidded for what seemed like forever, finally grinding to a stop at the very far end, just short of a ditch. It was over. When the ground crews and medics reached the aircraft, they stared in mute astonishment. The damage was incomprehensible. The tail section was connected to the main fuselage by a few spars and a thread of metal skin. It flexed visibly in the wind. No one could believe it had flown. Men gathered to have their picture taken next to the severed tail, a testament to luck, crew cohesion, and the B-17's legendary durability. For Franz Stigler, the war ground on. He never spoke of the incident, burying it as a private moment of mercy in a merciless war. He survived the conflict, becoming one of the few pilots to fly the Me-262 jet fighter in combat. The full, extraordinary truth of that October day would remain hidden for decades. It was not until 1986 that the story was pieced together. A retired Boston advertising executive and wartime B-24 pilot named Charlie Brown, no relation to the All-American's pilot, was researching a book. He tracked down Franz Stigler, now living in Canada. When Brown described the mission and the unique damage to the tail, Stigler's eyes filled with tears. "That was me," he said. He was the German ace in the Bf-109. The reunion between the crews of the All-American and the man who spared them was emotional and profound. They became close friends, bound by a shared experience that transcended the war they had fought. Franz Stigler passed away in 2008, Kendrick Bragg in 2006. Their story endures not as a tale of military prowess, but of an unexpected and profound moment of grace in the vast, impersonal machine of total war. It is the story of a German ace who looked at a mortally wounded enemy and saw not a target, but a crew of men who had already been defeated by circumstance, and who chose to let them go home.